Deputy Dean of Planning and a lecturer in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Psychology here at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. A special welcome to Professor Clive Landis, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. Professor Winston Moore, our Deputy Principal at the Cape Hill campus as well, and our special guests this evening, our lecturer of note, our Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, Professor Frederick Ochieng Odiambo, and his beautiful wife, Betty Ochieng, and members of the Ochieng family, and all of our deans and heads of departments, our Director of Graduate Studies and Research, members of the university community, specially invited guests, members of the media, online audience, and finally, everybody else, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this Friday evening here at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus for what promises to be a very, I think, a very significant lecture in our foray into understanding more about the continent and especially the knowledge systems of the continent. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special lecture entitled Beyond Myths, Understanding African Traditions in a Modern World, the Enduring Roles of Women, Family, and Elders. And this is by our very own Professor Frederick Ochieng Odiambo, Professor of African Philosophic Sagacity, and our Dean in the Faculty of Humanities and Education. This evening promises to be an enlightening one, and I'm sure I welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities and Education and the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. And as we venture into this journey through the role of women and elders in our in communities as they create venerated philosophic traditions from the continent. I wish to offer a very short reflection on our dean, and who is also my past head of department and forever colleague. If I had to offer one adjective for our professor, our chief, as we called him in the department, it would be quiet. And I was reading that there is a proverb that says, an African proverb that says, much silence has a mighty noise, and I hope he's going to make a mighty noise this evening when he breaks his silence. I have never encountered someone who embodied the strength of saying more in challenging situations by actually saying a lot less than everybody else. So I've always thought that as a wonderful character, just a wonderful feature of our dean. He watches and observes and shares, and there's much strength in those skills at present, and I look forward to watching and hearing as he shares this evening in what I won't call a final lecture before his retirement, because I'm sure we will walk away with a profound understanding, or the beginning of one, about the role of women and elders in African societies and knowledge systems. So I just say that as a short welcome, and now I give way to our professor, our Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Clive Landis, to offer some more remarks on behalf of the campus. So Professor Landis, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair of this evening's proceedings, Dr. Tara Innes. Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal, the UWI Cape Hill campus, our own Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, Professor Frederick Ochieng Odiambo, and Mrs. Betty Ochieng, and all of the members of the Ochieng family. Wonderful for you all to be here for this public lecture. I also recognize the Director of the School for Graduate Studies and Research, Sherma Roberts, and the former Director of the SGSR, Kahudi Mabana. Lovely to see you again. Members of the Ochieng family, wait, I've mentioned you already. The protocol list is always the hardest part about giving remarks. Distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, all a very pleasant good evening. and welcome on behalf of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus to this public lecture entitled Beyond the Myths, Understanding African Traditions in a Modern World, the Enduring Roles of Women, Family and Elders. We couldn't have anyone better to provide this lecture than Frederick Ochieng Odhiambo. I mean, let's just begin with his credentials. So Tara read it fairly quickly, but let's just enjoy his title. He is Professor of African Philosophic Sagacity. Now, come on, isn't that the best professorial title you've ever heard? You know, I feel quite inadequate. I'm just sort of Professor of Vascular Research. I mean, it's like Winston's just the Professor of Economics, you know. I mean, you know, it makes us feel inadequate, but you know, it doesn't really stop there because you know, Professor Ochieng, he's also, you know, that wonderful epitome of a scholar athlete. So, you know, I mean, I gathered that he had 3 career choices when he was in Kenya. He could either become a professional footballer, a marathon runner, or a professor of African philosophic sagacity. I'm glad that you chose the latter path. But, you know, that didn't stop him from showing us all up at the last UE Games, you know, and he was just sort of in touching, you know, reach of retirement, and he clocked the fastest time out of all participants from UE, including the students. I mean, I think we can clap for that. So, as has been noted by Tara, in Professor Ochieng Odhiambo's case, less is more. When Fred speaks, everyone listens. And, you know, I have actually a little crib sheet here because I don't feel that I can offer anything as wise as Fred can. So I kept this because it was at a conference. It was actually had to do with education. And this is very typical of Fred. He leaves you with something that you can take away and kind of ponder. So, you know, I remember when he offered this up, and I took a picture of it while it was on the screen. And he just said, I'm not, you know, favoring one quote over another, but here they are. So he's speaking about education. Knowledge is like a garden. If it is not cultivated, it cannot be harvested. That is an African proverb. The next one was, the happy person is the one with a healthy body, a wealthy soul, and a well-educated nature. That's Thales. I see someone nodding. By the way, if you recognize these, call it out, okay? So here's another one. I like this one. Educate the children, and it won't be necessary to punish the men and women. Pythagoras. And this is another very good one. Education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. Socrates. And then, there is nothing more divine than education. It is only through education that one truly becomes a person. Plato. And finally, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. So I shall take these Fred pearls of wisdom and I shall keep them for later use. But you know, when I came in here and then I saw this, I was just like, this is just so typical of Fred. So again, he's giving us a public lecture and he's giving us something that we can take away and ponder upon. And I've had sufficient primers from Fred to know that we're talking about Ubuntu here. So he goes, the importance of the UI. You, letter U, are because we, W-I, are. And since we are, therefore you are. UI. Isn't that wonderful? So I think that's the best way that I can end my remarks, because I can't improve on the wisdom and the sagacity of Dean Ochieng Odiambo. But please let me offer a very sincere appreciation from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. We have been very fortunate to have someone of Fred's stature and wisdom and work ethic, and his willingness to teach and mentor here at the University of the West Indies. Fred, you've been an excellent colleague, a wonderful dean. You don't look as if you're ready to retire, but I'm getting used to this by now. You know, I have people come to me, you know, like Pat Atherley came up to me and said, I'm retiring. I'm going, hello? You're retiring? You know, could you at least look like you're retiring? But we will miss you, Fred. And I wish you all the very best with all of your future endeavors, no doubt involving your family, and both here, in Kenya, I believe in Canada as well. We wish you all the very best. Thank you.
I was a bit mesmerized and forgot my duties as chair. So I would like to now invite Dr. Roxanne Burton up to introduce our speaker this evening, our colleague in the department, but also a very dear friend, and I won't say conspirer, but certainly they've worked together to bring philosophy and ethics and all of those central questions to bear on the campus. So I welcome Dr. Burton. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Dara Innes, our chair and deputy dean, Professor Landis, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of our campus, Professor Moore, Deputy Principal of our campus, and Dr. Sharma Roberts, our Head of the School of Graduate Studies and Research, and Professor Babano, former head. Other heads of departments and deans, other members of the university community, and our online community, and I'm saving the best for last. I'm saving Professor Ochieng Odiambo and his family, Mrs. Ochieng and his children in the audience, and I'm the Canadian boys online, I'm sure. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and thank you all for being here to join our celebration of our great chief. I call him Ochieng because if you've had a conversation with Ochieng about his name, he will tell you the story, and he's also published about the naming practices in his Luo ethnic group in Kenya, and he explained in detail. And so when Dr. Innes said he's quiet, yes, he speaks quietly, but he speaks passionately when he is passionate about a particular topic. And naming practices and the area where the name of his professorial title comes from, philosophic sagacity, is grounded in his recognition of the value of the African traditions. And we're going to be hearing more about that this evening. And when he talks about his name, you get that pride, where he talks about his name being about the time of day that he was born. But he also would tell the story about why it is that he's named Frederick. And he's not happy about the fact that he actually got that name. But we will leave, if you want to share that. But So even in terms of why I call him Ochieng, that was a teaching experience for me. And I speak as somebody who, he was instrumental in me joining the then Department of History and Philosophy, and has been a mentor, a senior philosophy lecturer figure to me. I've been happy to have team taught with him. And I can see why it is that he surprisingly only received one distinguished award for teaching, which he received in 2010, because he is an excellent teacher. His past students, and I've met past students from Kenya, because he taught, he's very happy to tell you that he is a graduate of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and he also taught at the University of Nairobi, Kenya, before moving on to teaching in Lesotho and then coming to the UWI Cave Hill campus. And from his days teaching in Nairobi, and as I said, I've met past students from there, to students that he's taught here, he's had a significant impact in terms of shaping their views on the nature of philosophy and the importance of philosophy. He's published as well, not surprisingly, in a variety of areas, but especially in the area of philosophic sagacity. And I should note that this is an area that was first developed by Odero Oroka, who was Ochieng's PhD supervisor, and then he went on to work with Odero Oroka and published with him, and has continued developing that particular area. And I think, I checked just to make sure, but he's the only person in the world with the title Professor of Philosophic Sagacity. All right? So I've spoken just a little bit about his teaching, about his publications, and I could go on. I could spend just a long time just speaking about how great he has been. I'll mention in terms of his development of philosophy at Cave Hill. He was instrumental in the development of the Cave Hill Philosophy Symposium, which is the flagship philosophy activity right across the region. And we have published 2 books, edited texts. Professor Mavana has published in that as well. But I also want to mention the work that he would have done as our head of department, as well as dean. Taro said he says a lot by not saying a lot, because what he does is that he works quietly and efficiently. So as HOD, he got so much done, but he wasn't one to, as they would say, toot his own horn, because his view was that I have work that I have to do and I'm going to do it. And he's taken that same kind of approach to his work as dean. And so I have been happy, pleased, honored to have had him as colleague, as teacher, as mentor, as head of department, as dean, and honored to be able to thank him here publicly. I've done it privately, for all that he's done in terms of helping to grow philosophy at UWI, not just at Cave Hill, but at UWI and in Barbados more broadly. And I want to say one more thing. Outside of his academic work, he's a serious family man. He loves talking about his children. he loves talking up that the fact that he's now a grandfather is such a lovely thing for him. And I will also mention that, yes, he is a serious athlete and a lover of athletics and football. And he's very happy this season because Liverpool has won. Yes, yes. So he's going out on a high in terms of the football. So he will remember his last year of active working as a year that Liverpool won. And on that note, I use that to highlight his passion, because the passion that he shows for athletics, for supporting his Kenyan athletes in the Olympics and so on, is the same passion that he shows in his work in general. And you're going to see that passion coming out when he speaks to us now on a topic that he loves talking about. So I hand over to you, Ochieng.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Right. I'm very, very happy that you've found time to attend this particular lecture. Right. Now, I'll dive straight into the lecture. Right? A lot has been said about me. Right. I appreciate it. Right. But I'll go straight into the lecture. Right. Which has to do with African traditions, right? Traditions within African cultures, right? Which have been misunderstood, right? So I hope that today, as we move out of this place, some of those conceptions will turn out to be mythical and will move into reality, all right? Now, in order to understand and appreciate traditional African societies, right, one must understand the notion of vital forces, right? Vital forces. The universe, right? The universe, the world, is made up of forces, right? Vital forces. So the universe is nothing other than permeation of vital forces all over, right? But then those vital forces have categories, right? So one must appreciate the notion of vital forces for you to understand African behaviors, customs, cultures, etc., etc. Because that essentially is where African philosophy revolves, right? African philosophy revolves around the notion of vital forces, for vital, so to speak, right? Now, within African philosophy, I want to just identify three sections because of time, right? And show that African philosophy, their ontology, their ethics, their epistemology, the notion of punishment and reward, all of it revolves around the notion of vital force, right? We begin with the notion of African ontology, their ontology. What is their view of being, right? Being, right, within African ontology is that, the universe has various categories of forces, 6 in particular. Of course, some authors put it at 5, but I usually put it at 6. There are 6 categories within African ontology, Right? At the very top of the ontology, you have this supreme force, the force in itself, the creator of all other forces. That is the category of God. Right? Below that category, you have the ancestors. Right? That's the second category in the hierarchy of vital forces. Below that, you have us, the living beings, right? So we are in that particular category, the third category. But take note that with time, we'll transition into that second category. Right? So really, the second category is nothing other than the living beings who have been, right? The fourth category of forces has to do with animals, right? Animal vital forces. And then below that, the fifth, you have plants. And then at the very bottom, the sixth category, you have inanimate objects, right? Things without biological life in them, right? So that's the hierarchy within African ontology. But I want to emphasize that that ontology is actually very anthropocentric, right? It revolves around the third category, the living beings, right? Us, you and me. It revolves around it. Right? It is the most important, in a sense, category within that ontology. Because God is there, God, the first category, right? This supreme force created all of us, including man. Right? And actually, it is the divine will that that third category, that everything should revolve around that third category of man. Right? Ancestors exist because of the third category. Right? If the third category ceases to exist, you'll not have the second category. Right? Category 4, 5, 6, those ones were created by the supreme force to benefit the third category, human beings. Right? So everything revolves around that third category, despite the fact that they occupy the third position in the rang. Right? But more importantly is that that category, right? I mean, that ontology, all those categories, there should be some kind of balance within them, all right? So that if and when you're in the third category, like all of us, right, you should not behave as if you belong to the first category. No. That is wrong. You should not behave as if you belong to the second category. No, doesn't work that way. Neither should you behave like an animal. That's wrong. Or a plant. Right? Each category, should behave the way it's supposed to behave. But of course, within each category, there's a hierarchy as well. Right? So within a third category, for instance, it's only the first category which does not have any hierarchy, because that's the supreme vital force. Right? But all these other categories have categories within them. Right? So within the third category of us, we are not all equal, so to speak. Right? We are equal in the sense that we share in the same vital force which makes us what we are and not what we are not. Right? But within that category, of course, we also have special forces which distinguishes us. Right? I'm not my wife, and my wife is not me. But we are both human beings. We share the same vital force, we belong to the same category, but we have additional forces which punctuates us, all right? So to speak. Right? And then the other point is that, which I should underscore before I move on further, is that what this means is that, therefore, that you see the universe, everything is connected. Everything is interconnected, right? Through the vital forces, you have these 6 categories, but they're all connected, right? You may be seated there and I'm standing here, but it's not that we are really separate, so to speak, right? Right? We are still connected through the vital force of the 6th category, the air between us, right? So there's no distance between you and me. Our forces are interconnected that way, right? So that's why in the African worldview, action at a distance is possible, right? I may be in Barbados, somebody else may be in the village in Kenya, but that distance, it doesn't mean that there's a gap between us. They can still reach me, right? And I can also reach them. So as I'll say momentarily, if my vital force is being diminished, right, they can enhance it for me, despite that distance, because we are still connected, all right? Or better yet, if they have something which I've directly mingled with, they could use it to enhance my vital force. African ontology, right? Now, when it comes to their epistemology, right, knowledge, the theory of knowledge, you know, who is knowledgeable? Who is a learned person? Who is a wise person? Who is a sage? So knowledge is not bookish, right? A knowledgeable person is someone who knows the 6 categories of vital forces, and even more importantly, the person knows how those forces interact. He's aware of the principles, the rules which govern the interaction or interrelation of those forces. That is the wise person. Right? So this wise person would know that, for instance, if my vital force, something is interfering adversely with my vital force, it is diminishing my vital force, then this wise person, this knowledgeable person, this sage, right, knows which vital force he would mix with my vital force to enhance my vitality. He knows, for instance, the kind of herb, right, the vital force of whatever herb, which when mixed with my vitality, it will increase my vitality. He also knows the vital force, which when mixed with my vital force, would diminish my vital force. But of course, a sage would not be interested in that, would not go that route, because that is wrong, as we shall see when it comes to African ethics. All right? So that's the person who is knowledgeable. Not this person who has his BA, his master's, his PhD. Yes, you have them, good. But do you know how the universe operates? Right? That's where knowledge is. So that's why you find that in traditional societies, knowledge is associated with the elders, right? Because they have lived experience. They've experienced things, and from those experiences, they've learned a lot. They know which forces to mix so that a certain result would accrue from it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the wise person, okay? It's not simply knowing that 1 + 1 is 2. Okay, yes, you know it, but how does it help humanity? How does it enhance in the human vital force? That's the critical part of it, okay? So in other words, the epistemology is fairly practical. Now, let's come to the ethics. Ethics, which has to do with human conduct, right and wrong actions. When is an action wrong? According to African ethics, a wrong action, right, or a wrong conduct or behavior is this behavior, right, which actually diminishes the vital force, human vital force, right? That's a wrong action. And it's an action you ought not engage in. That's wrong. But any action which enhances human vital force, right, that's it. That's the right action, and you ought to engage in it. Right? So the ethics is also explainable in terms of enhancement and diminishing of human vital force. All right? So when I'm hungry, for instance, when I'm hungry, that's not right, isn't it? When you're hungry, actually, it means that your vitality is diminished, right? Your vital force is diminishing, right? That's why it's not something good. It's not right, right? So what should you do? You should do something to right it, to enhance your vital force. So what do? You eat. Yeah, eat some food. That's the right, normal, correct thing for you to do. Okay? If you refuse to eat yet you're hungry, no. No, it doesn't happen that way. You are going against divine will, this supreme vital force. Okay? You eat if you're hungry. And in case you don't have food, you don't have money to buy food, right? But I'm there, right? And I give you food. That's the right thing to do because I'm enhancing your vitality, right? But if I'm there, I have food, but you're hungry, but I'm not giving you food, I'm not sharing it with you, no, it's wrong. It's morally wrong. That's evil, right? Goes against divine will. Because the idea is enhancement of human vitality. All right? So, principle, when I steal your car, is that a right action? No, it can't be right, because by doing that, that action by itself will diminish your vitality. Right? There are some things which you'll not be able to do because I've now run away with your car. That's wrong. Okay? But take note. Within African ethics, the idea is that, you see, there are times when you may diminish somebody's vital force, right? But it's because you are blinded. You are blind. When you are diminishing that vital force, you are blind, right? You are not in your right senses, so to speak. Perhaps you are very annoyed, you are angered, right? That's why you acted that way and interfered negatively with somebody else's vital force. Okay? On the face of it, that's not right, because you've diminished somebody's vital force. But then again, the mere fact that you are annoyed, angered, mitigates it, so that you cannot be held responsible, morally responsible for that action, for diminishing that force, because you are blind. Right? But the point is that if and when you start seeing again, right? When you are no longer blind, when the anger is gone, when you are yourself, the right thing to do is to apologize for the action which you committed. Because by apologizing, you are now enhancing that person's vital force. So apology actually enhances somebody's vitality. And that's what one should do. If you are no longer blind, right, you can see, so to speak, figuratively speaking, but you have still refused to apologize, the divine will deal with you eventually, right? Because that's very, very, very wrong, so to speak. So that's ethics. So you will notice that African philosophy, their ontology, their epistemology, their ethics, etc., revolves around the notion that things are all interconnected and revolve around the third category of human vital forces. Okay? That's where everything revolves. Hence, you find that traditional African societies are therefore communalistic rather than individualistic, right? The focus is on the community, right, rather than the individual, right? Because of that philosophy or vital force because of their ontology, right, which influences their ethics, their epistemology, their psychology, you name it, all right? Traditional African societies are communalistic, right? So I'll say something about that communal spirit, but allow me to read now, all right? But even if you don't allow me, I'll read anyway. All right? So, now in traditional African life, the individual does not, and indeed cannot exist alone. Right? You cannot exist alone, except collectively. This is essentially because in traditional African society, everything is amalgamated. It is fused. Everything is fused. Each and every individual owes his existence or her existence to other members of the society. The existence of other members of society, including those of past generation ancestors, and that of individuals, are intricately interwoven, all right, connected, bearing in mind that the thoroughly fused nature of traditional African communities, the society is therefore responsible for the overall well-being of its individuals. Right? The individual is nothing but a reflection of his or her society. The corporate group humanizes the individual. It is what gives humanity to the individual. It is what turns the individual into being a human being. In other words, it is the group that humanizes an individual's being. It is what transforms a being into becoming human. In the absence of members of the group, the individual would simply remain at the level of being, or just mere force, the level of just there-ness, or, to borrow César's word, thingness. Right? You are just a thingness, okay? So in other words, it is the others who make you what you are, right? So in other words, therefore, the we, right? When you talk of we, the us, the we, in traditional African societies is not simply a collection of individuals. Right? The we is not an addition of individuals. The we is not additive, so to speak. That we is a fused we, right? Where you cannot, in a sense, metaphorically speaking, distinguish the individual from the community, because it is the community that gives being, meaning, and identity to the individual. Okay? And this is where Ubuntu comes now, right? The Bantu of Southern Africa have this philosophy of Ubuntu, right? Which comes from the Zulu phrase, Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabantu, which literally translates to a person is a person through other persons. Right? A person is a person through other persons. It is other persons which make you to be a person. If other persons are not there, then you cannot be a person. You'll just be a thing, just thingness, so to speak. All right? So if you want to engage in the exercise of thingifying, so to speak, others, then simply put him, isolate him, right? I've thingified him, so to speak, right? And a Kenyan scholar, Mbiti, actually puts it so well, right? Here he says, he came up with this now famous slogan of, I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. Right? So in other words, it is the we which gives meaning to the I. Without the we, the I ceases. Right? You are, yes, but because of the we. But since we is, you should be thankful. It's what makes you what you are, right? And of course, that's what I've restated in what you've been given, the bookmark, right? I usually tell my students in African philosophy class, and even introduction to African philosophy, that you see, the University of the West Indies is a unique university in the universe, right? The University of the West Indies, right? Because the acronym is UWI. You, we, right? You, we, okay? And I will tell them, paraphrasing BT, that you are because we are. And since we are, therefore you are. So you, we. That's you, we. Right? Okay. So in other words, it's a recognition, the University of the West Indies, UWI, right, recognizes that even in matters academic, communalism is important. No one has monopoly of knowledge, right? You are not you in yourself. You are you because of we, all right? Right? The lecturers, the administrators, the others, that's why you are, right? If you remove those ones, then you are not, okay? So you, we, right? So those who are associated with you, we should be very proud. I think that's a slogan which we should try and blow it up, right? Now, I want to talk briefly again about marriage in traditional Africa, right? Now again, in the domain of social philosophy, right, the institution of marriage serves well as an example to illustrate the individual and communal emphases in Western or European societies and traditional African societies, right? In the Western European world, you know, they conceptualize marriage as a contract, right? As a contract between two individuals, the bride and the bridegroom. Okay, that's what marriage is in the Western European jurisdiction, Christian jurisdiction. Okay, it's a contract between two individuals, the bride and the bridegroom. Out of courtesy, right? Out of courtesy, they may seek the consent of their parents, but it is not really necessary, right? Whether they approve of it or not, that's their problem. So long as the two have consented, that's it, because marriage is a contract between these two individuals, right? However, according to African traditions, marriage does not involve individuals, right? It involves families, it involves clans, right? So in other words, it is the families or clans which get married, not individuals, strictly speaking, right? It's the family, this family, and that family, they come together. This clan, they come together, right? So in other words, in traditional Africa, therefore, marriage is a communal affair. It's a communal affair. So many people are involved, right? Several people must be consulted, right? Several people must exchange gifts amongst themselves. That is between the two families, so to speak, right? So in other words, in traditional African societies, marriage is an inclusive affair. Inclusive, not exclusive. It's an inclusive affair in which the community is involved, the whole community is involved in the discussions, the arrangements, and the planning. The community is involved in the different stages of marriage process, right from, you know, engagement, courtship, through to the exchange of gifts, and finally, the wedding. The wedding day, everyone is supposed to attend. Right? It's inclusive. You are supposed to attend. Everyone attends the wedding, right? If you don't attend, no. You don't need invitation card, right? All right? But you see, in the Western European system, since it's a contract between these two individuals, they spend time between themselves, right? Determining whom to invite, right? Yes, we'll invite the principal. He was my principal, so we'll invite him. The DP as well, we'll invite him. No, we'll not invite Tara. So they come up with a list, and then they send an invitation. And you only attend with that invitation, right? Otherwise, you'd be gate crashing, they say, right? But in traditional African weddings, there's nothing like gate crashing. You don't need any whatever invitation, you just attend, okay? Because it involves us, it involves we. It's not just him and her, but it is we, all right? Now, you see, that has implications, right? That view of marriage has implications. One of the implications is that divorce becomes very difficult. Very difficult. You cannot divorce. It's a difficult thing. Not impossible, but very difficult. Because it's not a contract just between you and him. No, it was contract between this family, that family, this clan, this clan. So for a divorce to take place, these two clans must agree to disagree, right? And they say, all right, fine, right? Let's separate. And of course, the consequence would be you return the gifts which you had exchanged. Right? It becomes almost impossible, isn't it? Because maybe we had gifted them with cows, they've eaten all of them and whatnot, so how do you return that? So divorce becomes very, very difficult. As opposed to, where it is a contract between two persons, you disagree, you say, okay, go to hell. Excuse the language, right? Right? You just separate, because it's just between the two of you. But see, in the other system, even if you disagree, fine, because it was a contract between families, between clans, right? They'll always try to resolve the problem which was there, right? So they'll sit you people down, what was the problem, and they'll try and resolve it. Right? So that's the communal spirit which is involved therein. Another implication, which might appear strange to some, is that we don't have, most traditional African societies, we don't have widows. There are no widows. Right? When the husband transitions, right, moves on, right, to the second category, right, becomes an ancestor, right, or a living dead, okay, as that's the terminology Mbiti uses, that when somebody dies, transition, immediately it's still, okay, yes, is leaving the third category, moving into the second, but is still not right in the second, but has almost left the second category, it's third category, so that's a living dead. Yeah? So even if a husband moves on, transitions, right, that does not mean that the wife is widowed. Because take note, who are married? The clans, right? It was the clans. So you'll still be, if I'm to use the Western terminology, you'd still be Mrs. the person who has transitioned. Right? So in other words, death in traditional African communities does not dissolve marriage. All right? But of course, in the Euro-Christian system, of course, the death of one party automatically dissolves the marriage, so that the spouse who is left behind, so to speak, is free to remarry. But in the traditional African societies, no, you cannot remarry because you are still married. Right? You cannot remarry when you are still married. Right? That would mean being married twice, is it? Having two husbands, it doesn't work, right? So those are some of the implications, all right? Now, the family. Just as marriage in traditional African is a communal affair, so is the same with the concept of family. Yeah? The family extends way beyond nuclear family of parents and their children to include other persons as well. It is an extended, in other words, a family encompasses a kinship network of multiple generations, including parents, children, grandparents, aunts, aunties, cousins, uncles, virtually everybody, right? Those who are living within a certain location, right? So it is important to note that the relationship between members of the extended family, right, are such that the form of address a person employs consists of an extension of nuclear family terms to a wider circle of relatives within the location. In traditional African societies, therefore, an individual would have several fathers and several mothers, for example. This is because such relational notions reflect social generational connotations and not biological denotations. All right? So what ordinarily, well, in English language you'd call an uncle, in African traditions would be a father. What you'd ordinarily, some of those whom you'd call an aunt, in African traditions is a mother. Your father's brother is your father, not uncle. That's a father. Your mother's sister is your mother. It's not an aunt, that's your mother. Okay? So fatherhood and motherhood involves a lot more people. All right? It's not restricted to your biological parent, so to speak. Right? An uncle in traditional societies, an uncle is actually your mother's brother. That's the uncle, your mother's brother. Right? And your father's sister, that's the aunt. Right? But your father's brother is your father. Your mother's sister is your mother. And interestingly, you rank them according to age. Age. So if your father, biological father, is, let's say, third in rank, right? He has an elder brother as the firstborn, then that elder brother is actually the first father. Baba Maduong, they say. That's the first father. Right? And is the one, in most cases, would play the role your father, biological father, would play in other systems, so to speak. All right? Your mother's senior sister is your first mother, Mama Maduong. All right? So, in African tradition, you have several fathers, you have several mothers. You have several brothers as well. Because the concept of cousin is non-existent in African tradition. You don't have cousins. Right? Those are brothers or sisters. Right? Okay? Those are brothers, sisters. You call them brothers, sisters, not cousins. Brothers, sisters. Right? In other words, even the idea of having these step things, right? Stepfather, stepmother, there's no stepping there. Either father or not father. It can't be a step. No, you can't step. No, right? Okay? So one would have so many brothers, so many sisters, many fathers, many mothers, so to speak. And here I have a story to tell. It has to do with my professor, Odero Roka, right? You know, he was employed at the University of Nairobi in the 60s, you know. Of course, it was after independence. But it was still very British yet, because I think 75% of the staff were still Britons. Right? So it was still very British when Odera was there. In fact, in the department, I think there were about 7 of them, 7 members of staff in the department, and he was, no, 2 of them were the only Africans. Right? So at some point, he would write a letter seeking compassionate leave because he has lost his father. Right? Of course, the head of department, Professor Stephen Neal, right, was the name, right? Stephen Neal would be very sympathetic, would approve it immediately, say, oh, okay, don't wait even for the Vice Chancellor's approval. Just go. Very sympathetic. And he goes. 2 months later, another letter. I've lost my father. Neil starts wondering, how many fathers do you have? Right? But you see, it's because they have different conceptions of fathers, right? Because in the West, your father is the biological father, right? If this other person wants to force himself as your father, he can only be a stepfather or do you have godfather, right? Godfather. You must have something preceding that father. It cannot just be open father, so to speak, right? Elders, right? The sages. Now, in traditional African societies, elders hold a revered status, right? Acting as keepers of knowledge, traditions, and cultural values. For their wisdom, experience, and ability to guide younger generations and resolve conflicts, they are really respected, right? Because they play a crucial role in maintaining social order, teaching of cultural norms, and ensuring the continuity of community traditions. Elders in traditional African societies are sages. Actually use the 2 terms more or less interchangeably, elders and sages, because technically they are the custodians of the wisdoms and beliefs of their societies. Right? So they are the ones, as I said earlier, right? Given their epistemology, they are the ones who know, the interaction of these forces. They know that, okay, when this thing happens, this is how it should be done. All right? So they are the ones who the society would rely upon to resolve issues, concerns, conflicts within the society. All right? So they occupy a rather special space. However, there are 2 types of elders. Right? In my research work, right, we've identified 2 types of elders, 2 types of sages. Right? All right, in one sense, one can say that a sage could be construed to be someone who is really grounded on the beliefs and customs of his people. Someone who knows those customs very well. Someone who knows that in order to marry, then A, B, C, D, E must take place. When somebody dies, for burial to take place, A, B, C, D, E must take place. They are the ones who know, right? Since they've seen it all, right? So, sages are like a mirror of the society. When you want to know what the beliefs of some society, they mirror them for you. They act as a mirror of society because they know the systems. Okay. However, some sages go beyond that. Right? Some sages are philosophic as well. Right? They are sagacious, yes. They're sagacious in that they know the wisdoms and beliefs of their people. But over and above that, they are rationally critical of those beliefs and they attain a philosophic capacity. Right? So those sages are we refer to them as sage philosophers, as opposed to other sages who you can call them, we usually call them folk sages or mere sages, right? Mere sages are times when you want to engage them, right? When you want to engage them rationally, at times they give in so easily, right? So once, assuming you want, they will tell you that, okay, if you want to do A, then you must follow A, B, C, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But when you ask him now, why 1? Why do 1? Why do 2? Why do 3? They'll tell you, no, that's how the system works. That's how it has been. Right? That's how we do it here. Right? They would fail to give you a rational justification of that. Right? But a philosophic sage, if you ask him, he would engage you and try to tell you why those customs are the way they are, so to speak. Right? So we have folk sages and philosophic sages. Right? As you were told when I was being introduced, my research focuses more on sages who are philosophic as well, right? Philosophic sagacity. In other words, mine is not simply just to know what these things are. Yes, I know most of them, but why are they the way they are? Why is it that polygamy or polygyny, right? Polygyny is practiced in African traditions. Of course, a folk sage will tell you that that's how it has been, right? But a philosophic sage would rationalize over that, would be critical about it. And in some cases, they may tell you that, okay, I think in future, moving forward, perhaps A, B, C, D should be amended to fulfill the changing trends, so to speak. All right? So in other words, a philosophic sage is useful in that it also assists the society adopt changing ideas. As things become modern, right, they would also suggest modifications which could be made to some of the principles which underlie their customs, so to speak, right? So all said and done, therefore, sages play a cardinal role in their respective communities. Thus, thoughts of sages, if articulated and documented, is one sure way of avoiding or at least downplaying the invasion of foreign ideas to a culture, especially those ideas which are obnoxious, those ideas which are against common sense. Africa today is at crossroads, right? Continent of Africa, when it comes to matters of culture, is at crossroads. It is under invasion of foreign cultural elements of all sorts, right? There is need, therefore, to accord sages, philosophic sages, prominent roles in their societies. Otherwise, the societies will end up being swallowed as undignified appendages of foreign cultures. All right? So, my good audience, to move beyond myths about Africa in general, and traditional Africa particularly, there is urgent need to grant more operational spaces to sages, especially the philosophic sages in their various nation states, in their various countries. With that done, African traditions will start functioning properly in the modern world, so to speak. It will be able to adopt the many good things from foreign cultures, and also get rid of some of their customs which have become anachronistic. And it is the philosophic sages who can play that role commendably. Right? So I want to thank you for listening to me. You are because we are. And since we are, therefore, you, we. Shukran. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm now reminded of that proverb that I quoted before. Much silence has a mighty noise. I think we need to make a mighty noise for Professor Ochieng's I can't tell you how many times in that lecture I've said to myself, why are you retiring? This is exactly the moment that we need to hear so many of these messages, because I think when we think about technological change, when we think about artificial intelligence, on the way here I was listening to something on quantum physics and your discussion on the ontology of how things interrelate has such an application to our understanding in a very Caribbean but also African sense of scientific concepts. And so it moves beyond philosophy, I think, for all of us, and particularly the ethical approach is something I think it is so simple. Something that it takes away from your vitality is wrong, but something that enhances it is good and beneficial. So I can only move to questions and answer, the question and answer period, by asking my fellow audience members to come up to the microphone. If you have any questions, we'll take those questions. And I think there are some questions that might come in from the online audience. I will defer to audience members first, but of course I might have some questions too. So if anybody has some questions, you can move to the, Terrence, do you have a? Mm-hmm.
Right. My question is from the online audience, Dean. And the first one, how have African traditions evolved over time, particularly in the context of women, family, and elders? Are these changes driven primarily by external influences or internal cultural shifts?
Did I take it?
You want to come up here?
Thank you.
Can this work?
Terrence, where do you want
Is
to
it?
take the question?
It's working, right? Can you? All right, right. Yeah, good question. I think it is actually both. It's both, right? Okay, it's both internal and external. Because as I indicated towards the end of my lecture, is that the essence of philosophic sagacity is to marry traditional African cultures with foreign cultures as well, but not just any culture, right? Because some aspects, some foreign ideas or habits are actually, what would you call it? Obnoxious? I don't know. I can't think of a better word, right? They don't make much sense. Right? They are that they actually diminish vitality, human vitality, right? They don't add value to human vitality. They diminish them. So those ones, philosophic sages should be able to have those ones put to one side, right? But then embrace the good thing. Because here the idea is that not everything which is traditional is good. And not everything which is not traditional, which is modern, is bad. No. Both systems have the good and bad. So the idea is to take the good from each system and merge them together so that you end up with a conglomeration of good things. And of course, as society evolves, so would the cultural aspects also evolve. But the important point is that the adoption of good foreign practices should be built upon the good practices, the traditional practices, so to speak. In other words, the base should remain traditional, so to speak. The additives should be good from the external world. So it's both external and internal. Some internal ones are anachronistic, right, which should be done away with, or modified, so to speak, right? So, for instance, I've often argued that there's the institution of widow guardianship in traditional African societies, widow guardianship, though I think anthropologists, Western anthropologists, refer to it rather horribly as wife inheritance, something like that. But technically, it is widow guardianship, right? So you see, that is something which I think should still happen, even in the modern world, right? Because, for instance, in the 90s, right, we had argued in Kenya then that, that's when AIDS was really terrible, right? Parents were dying, leaving children orphaned, right? And you see, because of that institution of widow guardian, most of those orphans were taken care of. Because within that system, you have many fathers, you have many mothers, so to speak. So that's something which should not be abandoned. We should build upon it or modify some aspects of it so that it fits the modern world. The orphans need protection.
Thank you.
Well done, Prof. Really great lecture. As the economist in the room, I'm going to ask the economic question. One of the things I took away from your lecture is the need for us to have institutions that are not individualistic, so that you don't have a corporation that concentrates wealth into the hands of a single individual, but you have corporations that are owned by society. Does that fit into your model? Does that fit into your idea that you need institutions that are more inclusive of the community rather than institutions that concentrate ownership, concentrate power into the hands of a single individual?
All right, thank you, DP. That's a good question. Really, that's it. I think that's my lecture points in that direction, right? In other words, you see, in a communal system, that would not be a problem. But you see, in a system where this is mine, right? Yeah. This, it's mine, so nobody can. So I get your point. So this institution should not be individualistic, but there should be that element of communalism, because in the final analysis, I think it is that communalistic spirit which will go a long way in enhancing the vitality of most people, as opposed to if it is just a particular individual. So that's why you find, for instance, in most traditional African societies, right, most, not all, most, you find that they have a system of chiefs who are elders, rather than having one individual on top as a president or as prime minister, so that everything now revolves around that person. They would have a system, a council of elders or chiefs who would, take and guide matters within their societies, so to speak. And you see, even I think it is something which, though I'm not saying we don't do it at KVL, there's that aspect, right, which, you should always be interested and concerned when a colleague's vital force is being diminished. Right? When your colleague, is not, they're not happy, they're having issues, their vitality is not and being enhanced, And you see, that can only happen well under that communalistic environment, where I would not fear to approach the principal's office, because I know that he will accommodate me. But you see, if, for instance, the principal's office is a kind of ivory tower, then it becomes problematic. Even when I have an issue, I'll start wondering now, will the principal really listen to me? Will the DP really be of help? But if you have this communalistic aspect, then it becomes very easy. I have an issue, I approach my head of department, I approach my dean, I approach most people in authority, because they're there to serve the others, so to speak, right? Rather than wielding power, right? The power that they have is meant to serve the betterment, should be beneficial to members within that community. Right? So I agree. Communalism is an aspect which we should not lose sight of, even in the modern world. Though unfortunately, we are tending to be moving away from communalism, and we are becoming very, very individualistic. We are very I-centered rather than we-centered. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Principal?
So, Professor Ochieng Odiambo, I'm sure that many of us are quite concerned with the evidence for quite a lot of deterioration in mental health. Not just in our community, all over the world, particularly young people. And how does African sagacity address this issue? It seems to me that from everything you've said, the isolation that people are having in moving away from a play-based childhood where you are socialized to a phone-based childhood where you're very often isolated and exposed to all the worst things, what do you call them? Obnoxious things in the world without any filters. That this must be part of the issue. And I'm asking you, what kind of insights can we get from African philosophy to address the issues of mental health deterioration, which is apparent in our societies?
Right, thank you for that question. Philosophic sagacity has several dimensions to it. It has many aims, so to speak. At its inception, one of the major aim was that, you see, within philosophy, the idea was that Africa did not have a philosophy, or rather it had a kind of inferior philosophy, if at all it was philosophy. So some people are referring to it as ethno-philosophy. So philosophic sagacity, one of its aim was to rebut that, to show that no, is the same thing. In the West, even this thing you're calling ethno-philosophy is just, it's not something peculiar or unique to Africa. Even the other societies have it, just as much as critical, independent thinking, philosophy in the second order sense is not a monopoly of other societies. Even African societies have it. So I think that was the aim in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It has been silenced now, right? The other aim was, we were concerned with the idea of, when you look at African nation states, they are very divisive, so to speak, at political level, so to speak. There's a lot of ethnicity, negative ethnicity, so to speak. So, for instance, like Kenya, for instance, has about 44 ethnic groups, right? And you find that at political level, political parties are formed based on those lines, right? So the aim again was that, and this was a bit ambitious, but we are still working on it, to identify the basic underlying principles in all these ethnic groups, right? And then after that, philosophic sages from those various ethnic groups would come together and try to harmonize those basic principles. Of course, some of them would conflict because there are some aspects of culture which contradict, right? But then the philosophic sages would try and harmonize those, right? And after harmonizing those basic principles, then the nation state would build a national culture out of it, right? So that now people would see themselves as citizens, first and foremost, rather than as belonging to the various ethnic groups, right? As I said, that's something ambitious, at least in Kenya, right? Because I think so far, I think it's only in central province of Kenya, western part, right, where those basic principles have been unearthed. Right? There's still a lot to be done, unearthing them and then, putting them together so as to build a national culture. And if I'm to come to your question now, you see, there's a sense, therefore, that the concern was that at political level, it was very problematic. Right? People were not comfortable, are still not very comfortable, which impinges on their mental health as well, amongst other things. Right? So there's a sense in which, therefore, if a national culture is constructed on these basic principles which have been harmonized, then it will assist in doing away with some of these aspects which impugn on the health or well-being of the citizen, so to speak. Right? So from that angle, it would assist in reducing the mental health or vitality of human beings within the country. So you'll realize that, for instance, a country like Tanzania, right, is way ahead of Kenya and Uganda, most other countries, because I think their first president did a good job, because he was, in a way, a sage, right? A philosophic sage, right? So he came up with some basic underlying principle which were very firm, and he built a national culture out of it, of ujamaa, right? And you'll find that at that level, Tanzania usually has less problems than Kenyan. If you read, recently, I think 2, 3, 4 days ago, I think some Kenyans were denied, or rather deported, from Tanzania. They had gone to Tanzania to listen to some whatever, but they were deported immediately. Right? But you see, they were deported according to Tanzanians because they felt that the Kenyan system is such that it is very divisive, so to speak. So they're usually very careful about politicians from Kenya going in there because they may dismantle the comfort in Tanzania, and by extension, the mental health of Tanzanians.
Dr. Roberts?
Prof, you've served us up an intellectual treat, but I have 2 questions. And one is that in your treatment, you seem to have homogenized Africa, and the epistemological and ontological basis seems to be the same across all of the African countries, and I wanted to know if there are any differences across countries in terms of those epistemes. And my second question is, why should we believe the philosophical sage in terms of the recommendations? Because he or she, as an intellectual, comes to it with their own values. And then how do you then determine, using all the values of the West and of Africa, that this is the way that African societies ought to go? So you haven't really, I'd like you to just treat with axiology in terms of values a little bit more in getting to those recommendations. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, okay. You're right. You know, Africa is not homogeneous, right? As I said, you know, Kenya, in Kenya by itself, there are 44 ethnic groups, right? And some of their cultures actually conflict, right? So, for instance, the community I come from, initiation into adulthood until recently was quite different from initiation ceremonies in other cultures within Kenya, for instance, very different, right? And you see that has at times posed problems in the sense, especially when it comes to inter-ethnic marriage, right? Because you find that if you are a Luo, for instance, getting married to someone from the Kikuyu ethnic group becomes a bit tricky, right? Because there's a sense in which they'll not see you as an adult, right? Because they have a different initiation ceremony, right? The Kikuyus, the system is different, but Luos have their own, right? So that you see now a Kikuyu gentleman, for instance, marrying a Luo lady, they'll see that Luo lady as, no, you're marrying a child, because that one has not gone through. So there are conflicting cultures. It's true, that's true. Right? But all we are saying, nevertheless, despite all those differences, there's a sense in which there's something which runs through most of them. Like especially at the metaphysical level, right? At the metaphysical level, when you start talking of increment and decrement of vital forces, it runs through all of them. It's only that they may differ on some particular instances, but generally at a theoretical level, it runs through, right? But when it comes to the specifics, there are differences. Now, philosophic sages, why should we trust them? Yeah, they are academics here. Now, yes, but I wish they are academics from the UWI. All right? Okay, but take note, what I said was that, you see, the philosophic sage is a sage. And by virtue of being a sage, he is grounded in the wisdoms of his community. He knows them. All right? Okay? But over and above that, he rationalizes. He tries to give it a firm foundation. And of course, it is true that in some cases, they may recommend that, okay, this one now, right, we should adjust it, so to speak. A philosophic sage could do that rather than a folk sage. A folk sage, you know, in a sense, lacks the intellectual capacity to go up to that level, right, which a philosophic sage has, right? So even this philosophic sage, he's still a sage, right? He's not just philosophic, right? It is those, some of us who are philosophic but not sagacious, who just destroy and tear everything based on our own personal critical assessment of the situation. But a philosophic sage bases it on the customs and traditions of the people. So you should trust him. It is this innocent or core philosopher whom you should be a bit careful about. So, for instance, I've always had issues with philosophers, some philosophers, not all, some, right? In the sense that, you see, some of our colleagues in philosophy actually have done a lot, some disservice to the discipline, in the sense that, they emphasize so much on rigorous, critical thinking, assaying everything, turning everything upside down, right? To the extent that you start wondering that what is the goal? What is the aim? What is the end product? Where is he leading to? Right? To an extent that some persons, therefore, view philosophers as different. All right? They are seen as different people because, they interrogate things to a farthest extreme, to an extent that they even get to the conclusion that the supreme force has died. Right? God is dead, right? Some philosophers have actually gotten to that conclusion, that, God is dead, right? So you are on your own, don't rely on, that one died long time ago, right? So some, in fact, pull it to the extreme. They want you to question everything, including your existence, right? You doubt even your existence, right? So that, some people, when they read such philosophers, they start wondering, okay, because the end result is such that, they are reasoning for its own sake, so to speak. The conclusions they arrive at seem to go against common sense, seem to go against wisdom. Right? That's why in philosophic sagacity, the aim is that, philosophy should be accompanied with sagacity. Right? You should not move away from sagacity, to an extent that I've often argued, for instance, that, you see, when you look at the so-called great philosophers, somebody like Plato, Socrates, actually I see more as a sage. Because when you read Socrates, you see that his ideas were projected towards the betterment, well-being, enhancement of human vitality. Clearly speaking, you could. But you see, there are others who you'd wonder, where is this ending? Right? So at times, when I tell people my area of interest, my area of research interest is philosophy, when I just say philosophy, they start saying, oh, okay. They start seeing you as different because of the tradition which some of us have given. So, but philosophic sage, you should be comfortable with a philosophic sage. Right? You should be comfortable with me, so to speak.
Professor Cobley, do you have we have an online question, Professor Cobley, and I don't know if you, we'll take your question first and then.
Okay. Yeah. But just, I had an experience yesterday where I was, a young man was helping me pack groceries in the car, and he called me Daddy. And I wasn't sure whether he meant I'm an old fogey or a respected elder. But it got me thinking that that wouldn't have happened in the UK, where I came from. That's a Caribbean thing. So my question is, you've lived in the Caribbean now for more than 20 years. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think an African ontology is present in Caribbean society?
Yeah, right. Thank you for that. I think in the Caribbean, there are some elements of that ontology. You can feel it, right? Especially amongst some individuals, right? You can feel it, you can see it in them, their actions, their conducts, you can see it. But then in others, you don't see it. I mean, because you see, the Caribbean is interesting in that, you see, it is it's a part of several cultures, so to speak. Right? Have Western, Euro-Christian culture, Africans, whatnot. So there are some people whom have gone the other way, right? So that for them, this ontology doesn't make sense, right? But there are others who, nevertheless, you can feel them, you can feel it. So in the audience, for instance, I can see some of my students who are in my African philosophy class and who, in our discussions, you could see that ontology in them. But then in others, you could see that, no, they are very individualistic, right? They've gone the individualistic way and they know nothing or they don't care about this communal aspect of things, so to speak. So there's both of them, right?
Thank you. Terrence?
Yeah, we have 3 online questions. Can you provide us with some real practical examples of the difference between some components of African ethics and communal living and the Caribbean that you have observed? This is similar to the question.
You see, as I said, when you look at the Caribbean, true, there are several cultures in it, but you can still see some African aspects in it, so to speak. Though, in my conversations, for instance, with some of the Caribbean persons, especially the elderly, right? People of advanced age, you can see that, they have this communal thinking or aspect in them, right? Even when you look at the meals, some of the foods you eat, it's very, very African, though modified. So I think, what do you call it? Ugali, yeah? Kuku, right, kuku. Kuku, I think, is, in East Africa you call it ugali, or in West Africa it is fufu, right? In South Africa it is papa, So all those were transported, they came along. As much as there was a desire to cut off all those, right, so that they don't get here. But fortunately, I don't know, is it unfortunately for some, those also found their way in here, so to speak.
Okay. All right. And how has globalization impacted the family structure in African societies, especially regarding the roles of women and elders?
Yeah, things are changing. Things are changing, right? Especially when you read my book, I make it very clear that, okay, urban Africa, right? When you are in the urban areas in Africa, and some of those areas are more individualistic than even the European societies themselves. They've, embraced Europeanism, so to speak, right? That the traditional systems don't work there at all, so to speak, right? But in the villages, there's still a lot of that communal aspect, right? So within traditional Africa, there's that aspect, but in the urban areas, they seem not, to be abandoning some of those aspects. And that's why in philosophic sagacity, the idea is that, all right, we should merge these two, the goods from the two systems to come up with a system which is much better. Because the point is that somebody who thinks that everything African is good, traditional African is good, is misguided. And everybody, and anyone who thinks that everything Western is bad is also misguided. Both systems, as I've said, has both elements which we should try and merge and discard the bad. But of course, in Africa, it should be based on African traditions.
Okay.
In Europe, also in European societies, they should have European philosophic sagacity, all right? So philosophic sagacity is not a monopoly of Africa, right? Even in Europe, right? European sages should do more or less the same, right? Take the good from Africa and implement it in their societies. But since it is Europe, the basis should be their culture, right? Okay?
Right.
All right.
And one last online question. What is your take on the ambitious president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré?
That's political, huh? Yes, that's political. Yes, yeah. It's something I'll address in a different forum.
I think we'll take one more question, and then I will take prerogative and ask one final question, but one more question from you. So.
Good evening, Dr. Ochieng.
Evening.
I must say I am one of Professor Ochieng's first student in philosophy. And after leaving your training, I went on to teach ethics and citizenship at the Barbados
BCC,
Community
yeah.
College. And there I emphasize philosophic sagacity, African philosophy, because I have difficulties with Greek philosophy. Like, for example, Protagoras say man is the measure of all things, justice, might is right, and then ethical egoism and so on and so forth. But I want to know from you, to what extent do you think that we in the Caribbean have lost intergenerational socialization, intergenerational communication, and intergenerational interdependence? Because I find that the African, and what you have shared with us this evening, reminds me of the need for intergenerational communication, intergenerational interdependency, and there's a third one, intergenerational socialization. And I am asking that because I want to know, how can we use philosophic sagacity to help us with the social problems, particularly crime and violence among young men in Barbados and perhaps throughout the Caribbean?
Right, thank you, Nigel, for that question. I must say that, you see, Nigel was one of the first students I taught when I came, right? Was a very interesting student, right? Really loved African philosophy. And when I say I could see in the audience someone who really loved this communal aspect, I had Nigel in mind. And in fact, when he was still a student, right, Roxanne, as Roxanne said, we usually used to have this yearly symposium called CHIPS, right? Of course, COVID interfered with it, but we have revived it, right? Nigel used to attend those conferences, and not just attend to listen, he used to make presentations, right? And I recall very well one day, one of those, delegates, at the end of it all, was very surprised when I told him that Nigel was our undergraduate student. He couldn't believe it. He said he thought that he was a lecturer. So he was a good philosophy student. Now, Nigel, I want to throw the question back to you. Right? I want you to actually take a leading role, right, in the Caribbean, perhaps in Barbados, on philosophic sagacity. You remember I kept telling you that it is something which we should, see that we develop in the Caribbean and in Barbados. And I think you'll be one of the best persons, to push that agenda within Barbados. What you must do, what you should do, is first and foremost identify the sages. Right? After you've identified the sages, have conversations with them. Right? And in your conversations with them, you should be able, of course with my help as well, identify or distinguish the philosophic sages from the folk sages. Right? And then you make use of the philosophic sages to see how some kind of harmony in terms of whatever issue you have in mind could be resolved. Right? Because sages, take note that sages in any community, are respected sages, as opposed to philosophers. Right? Philosophers are usually looked at with, curious, suspicious eyes. But sages are respected. So identify them, have conversations with them, and see how eventually issues which you would have identified within, social issues you would have identified within the Caribbean or Barbados, you can start with Barbados, could be resolved using philosophic sagacity. So it could be an aspect of African sagacity, but within the Caribbean, so to speak. So that's my challenge to you. You should pick it up.
Thank you for that response. Just a little follow-up question on that note, and where are women as philosophic sages in this special group of people that need to be identified? So I was just wondering where can we elevate women and empower women to be part of this cadre of philosophic sages?
Yeah, you don't need to empower them. They're already empowered. They're already empowered. You don't need to empower them. Amongst the sages, take note that as I was talking, I kept talking of he, she, right? I was avoiding using he, because it would give the impression that I'm talking about men, male, right? What I was talking of he, she. So that we have, amongst the sages we've identified, include women as well. Right? So in one of the articles I've written, in fact, even one of my texts, An Introduction to African Philosophy, I've presented interviews with three sages, right? And one of the sages is a lady, right? And also, I think online as well, there was a time, Roxanne, where's Justin? Is he here? No, unfortunately. Yeah, okay, right. I think online there was Justin, who is with us teaching part-time. He was at Oxford, did his master's at Oxford. And when he was there, he organized a seminar, online seminar, which I gave to the students. And they have it, I think, online. And I've included extracts of my conversations with sages, which include 2 women as well. Right? So women, there are female sages as well, right? And also, just to add on that, is that, you see, in African traditional system, right, women actually play a significant role, an important role, right? As my wife would tell you, right? You see, there are some things which, if assume you wanted something in my house, actually it's not my house, it's a house, right? It's a house, right? So in African traditions, the house belongs to her, not the man. You say, I'm going Kaminrandi, right? That is her. That's her house, not me. So if you want anything there, even if you approach me, I'll direct you to her, right? Or I'll tell you, okay, wait, let me go and discuss it with her, right? I'll have to seek her consent, and then is when it will be released. So in other words, it's only that, okay, the structure within traditional African system is such that the roles are really stratified, right? So there are some which are specific, gender specific, right? So that you see, there are some things a man is not expected to do, and there are some things a female is not expected to do, right? So I usually, for instance, tell my students that, you see, my kitchen, right, I just use it as a pathway, right? Because where I park, the door, the entrance takes me through the kitchen, right? So I just use it as a pathway, right? But you'll not find me in the kitchen, you know, busy in the kitchen, right? Because that is a role, that is her role, right? But there are some things also you cannot find her doing. It's me to do, right? Because the roles are really stratified, so to speak, right? But it's only that with the change within the modernity, so to speak, right? You find that it seems that women seem to have more roles because they work as well. They go to work and then they also do the kitchen work, right? But men, their role seem to be less, because mine is just to see that, okay, the compound is fine, all those kind of things, whatnot, right? But the point is that they occupy an important role, so to speak. And also, another aspect is, you see, in other cultures, you know, she is Mrs. Ochieng, huh? Those ones are Ochiengs, right? Ochiengs. They have this surname, right? This is what I think Roxanne was referring to, but I'll try and be very brief because I'm usually very passionate about it. Right? But you see, in African traditions, okay, she's Mrs. Ochieng, Chi Ochieng, which means wife of Ochieng. Right? But at the same time, I'm also Jaod Anyango. Right? Jaod Anyango, that's who I am. Right? In other words, you can also call me using her name. Right? You can call my children using my name, or you can also call me using my children's name, right? But you see, all that is a reflection of the communal spirit, right? So an individual is not just an individual in and of himself. You are interconnected, right? You are husband of, wife of, friend of, teacher of, student of, someone from Barbados, and you can use all those as names. Those are names. They're designated names. So an African in my culture, I have so many names. Right? So for instance, when I go to their place, their village, they usually call me, I think, mostly they use Sandy, Baba Sandy. That's how they call me. Baba Sandy, which is my first daughter, Sandra. All right? Some people call me using my first son's name, Randy, Baba Randy. Right? Right? In their place, at times they call me Jaod Anyango. Right? And all those are my names. You can also call me using my father's name, which is Odhiambo. Right? Odhiambo is my father's name. But the point is that you must indicate the relation. Because I'm not just Odhiambo, I'm Ward Odhiambo. Ward Odhiambo. So you see, when you just call me Odhiambo, at times it confuses me. Because Odhiambo technically means somebody who was born in the evening. That's when my dad was born. That's why it's called Odhiambo. I was born around midday when it was sunny. That's why I'm Ochieng. Right? So I cannot be Odhiambo. Right? I cannot. Right? In fact, when you go to the village and ask for Odhiambo, they'll take you to my dad when he was still alive, not me. Right? In fact, if you say you want me and you're calling me Odhiambo, they'll think that you're being very rude because that's someone of a different generation. That's a father. You don't use somebody of a higher generation with the name. All right? You call him using the relation, Baba, right? Or Mama, not the name. Right? But you see, in this other system of surnames, I'm using his name. Right? And you see, it really cost me. Right? It really cost me a lot when I was in high school, because in my primary school, I went to a relatively mild primary school. Right? I mean, because in Kenya, there were 3 categories of schools: high class, middle, and low. So the primary school I went to was relatively African. So they were calling me Ochieng, 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 Ochieng. For my secondary school, I went to a high level secondary school, which at some point was referred to as Prince of Wales School in Kenya. Of course, today it's called Nairobi School. They changed the name. Right? So when I went there, my dad took me first day. Right? So they were saying, I'm Ochieng. My father is Odhiambo. So they were saying, how does this work? How come you're saying this is your son, but his name is Ochieng and you are Odhiambo? Right? So the principal, Mr. Parkwood, that was the name, Mr. Parkwood, right, kept asking him, what is the surname? What is the family name? What's the surname? But you see, my dad could not understand what this was all about. Because in my culture, we don't have that concept of surnames or family names. You have your name. Right? So my dad could not understand what he was saying. So he said, all right, you are Odhiambo? He said, yes. All right, fine. He put that down as my name, Odhiambo. And then they had a very funny system. He put Odhiambo, comma, F-O. So from that day, I became Odhiambo. All right? Really confused me. During roll calls in the mornings, because it was a boarding school in the morning, the class teacher would call the roll call, to determine those who are present, those who are absent. So we'd start calling names, present, sir, present, sir, Odhiambo. He would mark absent. And he would continue. And he would finish and then fold his whatever and start walking away. Is when I would say, I would realize, all right, I'm Odhiambo now. Right? I would follow him and say, no, I'm present. So he thought that I was being cheeky, and on one time, he actually earned me a lashing because he thought that I was being cheeky, a nuisance, rude, but it was because of differences, right, in systems and cultures. Because in my culture, if you are to call me using my father's name, you must indicate the relation, son of. I think the Irish also have such a system where you indicate the relation, son of. You don't just call Odhiambo, son of Odhiambo. Right? You can also call me using my mother's name, Nyathe Achieng. Right? or can call me using my grandfather's name, Nyakwar Odawa, etc. Those are all my names. So that when I start writing my names, I'll write it until Jesus comes back.
Well, thank you, Professor Cheng. I don't even know what to call you now. And I'm really sorry that we didn't have this conversation very early in our meeting. But I'm so pleased and thankful and grateful that I was selected to be chair of this session. I've learned so much, and I want to move the vote of thanks now. And just to say a wonderful thank you to Professor Cheng for sharing his wisdom, his sagacity, and his philosophic sagacity. So, I would like to thank the campus principal and the deputy principal for attending, and the office of the registrar for helping to find the location, Dr. Burton for her introduction of the speaker, the Faculty of Humanities and Education staff for pulling the event together, Educational Media Services and UWITV and Janet Caru's office, as well as our very valued online and in-person audiences today. It's a Friday evening, and I'm just so pleased to see such full seats and such an appreciation for the wisdom that is our dean in the Faculty of Humanities and Education. As Dr. Roberts had indicated, we usually have inaugural professorial lectures, and I think maybe we're starting a new tradition of faculty where we're going to be asking our soon to be retired, not final lecturers, but offering their words of wisdom as they move into another part of their lives. Maybe that will be a new tradition in UE, yes. So thank you again, and we invite you for refreshments on the outside, and we can exchange a little bit of camaraderie and collegiality here. And
yes, and also finally, I want to thank you all for your questions. I think it will make me rethink some of the positions and enhance my position. And thank you for listening to me, and I hope that I have enhanced your vital force.